Good day to everyone. Today, we will be discussing about dependency theory. Before we proceed to the discussion of the main theory, first, we will define the terms that we will encounter in this theory. Dependence refers to the situation in which the economy of a certain country is conditioned by the development and expansion of other economies to which the former are subjected. Dependency is an historical condition which shapes a certain structure of the world economy such that it favors some countries to the detriment of others and limits the development possibilities of the subordinate economics. A situation in which the economy of a certain group of countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy to which their own is subjected. Neo-colonialism is the survival of the colonial system in spite of formal recognition of political independence in emerging countries. The development of underdevelopment denotes that underdevelopment is not a natural condition but an artifact created by the long history of colonial domination in third world countries. Neo-Marxism versus orthodox-Marxism. Neo-Marxism sees imperialism from the peripheral point of view, while in orthodox Marxism, they see imperialism from the center's perspective. Neo-Marxism believed that time is right for social revolution, which is now. And orthodox Marxism advocates a strategy for two-stage revolution. In neo-Marxism, rural nature of revolution is encouraged, while in orthodox Marxism, urban nature of revolution is encouraged. Dependency theory differs from Western approach to studying political development. One difference is that this approach originated in a third world, primarily in Latin America, rather than among Western academics. Among the main authors of dependency theory, we have Andre Gunder Frank, Raul Prebisch, Teotinio dos Santos, Enrique Cardozo, Adalberto Torres Rivas, and Samir Amin. Third world dependency thinkers were concerned with explaining the unequal and unjust situations in which they and their nations found themselves. Third world countries were poor while developed countries were rich. Third world countries had bad health conditions while other countries had good health conditions. Third world countries had little military power while other countries had tremendous military resources. Third world countries faced starvation, while citizens of other countries had to worry about losing weight. Third world economies are monoproductive and agriculturally based, while economies in developed countries were diversified and industrialized. By almost any conventional socio-economic measure, third world countries were at the bottom of the scale. They had less education, less wealth, poorer health, less military power, and were dominated politically and economically by the first world. Dependency theorists ask why such inequalities existed. Their central concern was to understand the cause of inequality. They felt that such inequalities were unjust and sought to explain inequalities in order to change them and achieve their goal of increased equality among nations and peoples. Dependency theory has always been quite controversial. It incorporates some Marxism concepts. It addresses the sensitive issue of inequality, blaming inequality on the developed nations, and it originates in the third world. While modernization theory understood development and underdevelopment as a result from internal conditions that differ between economies, dependency theory understood that development and underdevelopment as relational. It saw the world's nation as divided into a core of wealthy nations which dominate a periphery of poor nations whose main function in the system is to provide cheap labor and raw materials to the core. It held that the benefits of this system accrue almost entirely to the rich nations, which becomes progressively richer and more developed, while the poor nations, which continually have their surplus drained away to the core, do not advance. Developed in 1950s, dependency theories held that for underdeveloped nations to develop, they must break their ties with developed nations and pursue internal growth. One type of policy crafted from this insight was import substitution industrialization, developed for lesser developed countries. In short, dependency theory attempts to explain the present underdevelopment state of many nations in the world by examining patterns of interactions among nations and by arguing that inequality among nations is an intrinsic part of those interactions. There are three historical forms of dependence. First is colonial dependence. This refers to the commercial and financial capital of the dominant country in alliance with the colonial state, monopolize the control of land, mines, and human resources, and the export of gold and silver and tropical products from the colonized countries. Second is the financial dependence. The economies of dependent countries were centered upon the export of raw materials and agricultural products for consumption in European countries. And lastly, technological industrial dependency. This refers to the emerge in the post-World War II era where industrial development began to take place in many underdeveloped countries. The major propositions of dependency theory are as follows. Third world countries do not exist in isolation. Political events in third world countries are directly related to events in first world countries. However, relations between first and third world countries are asymmetrical. The flow of power and control is from the first world, which is center or the core, going to the third world, which is the periphery. Third world political and economic events usually have a little impact on the first world, whereas political and economic events in the first world have a huge impact on the politics and economics of third world countries. There is a tremendous amount of interaction among core countries and peoples and between the core and periphery. There is a very little interaction just among periphery countries. The consequences of these are great, resulting in an isolated and weak periphery country having an unequal relationship with a united and strong core. Third, politics and economics are related. They cannot be understood apart from each other. Economic ties and relationships between core and periphery countries are particularly important. These are advantageous for the core and disadvantageous for periphery. Core-periphery trading patterns result in continuous growth for political and economic power of the core at the expense of the periphery. Economic trade causes a widening of the gap between developed and developing countries rather than narrowing that gap. Historically, lower-priced raw materials have been exchanged for higher-priced finished goods. Underdevelopment is not a natural state, but rather a condition that is caused. The fact that developed nations are actively underdeveloping third world countries as a result of the system of interactions between them. The underdevelopment of weak third world countries is directly related and makes possible the development of the powerful countries of the industrialized core. Both the center and periphery are part of world political system, and neither would exist without the other. Furthermore, so long as capitalism remains the dominant world economic system, there is no reason for the situation of development and underdeveloped countries to change. Underdevelopment is not a temporary condition but is a permanent condition. In fact, if the present world system does not change, we can expect the core to become more powerful and the weaker periphery in the future. Rather than catching up to the developed countries, most currently underdeveloped countries will fall farther behind. But in a limited number of cases where exceptional circumstances exist, it may be possible for an undeveloped country to move to the periphery to the core. The worldwide systems of relationships is duplicated within individuals' third world countries. There is a core area which dominates and exploits the periphery of the country. The nation's centers of economic, political, cultural, and military power are found in the national core, and the core's power and wealth grows more rapidly than of the interiors as a result of contacts and interactions between two areas. The urban sector becomes increasingly powerful, while the rural sector becomes increasingly weaker. Resources from the periphery to the center, the whore profits at the expense of the periphery as a result of movement of products and resources. The passage of time does not bring a growth equality within the country, but rather brings about an increasing gap between life in the capital and that in the countryside. Metropolis Satellite Model. Metropolis Satellite Model explains how the mechanism of underdevelopment works. When the conqueror implanted new cities in the Third World with the aim of facilitating transfer of economic surplus to Western countries, the national transfer of economic surplus has been produced under development in Third World countries and development in Western countries. Metropolis Satellite Model is a structure in which central region, which pertains to metropolis, dominates a peripheral region which pertains to the satellite, mainly through economic means. It is a concept developed by Frank to describe the process whereby economic surplus flow out of the Third World into the industrial capitalist countries. The structure and process begins in the Third World, where surpluses flow from rural and provincial regions into urban and commercial centers via the control of trade by indigenous and foreign merchants. Goods which are exported to the advanced countries contributes to the flow of surpluses and profits from trade accumulating in the advanced countries. Thus, the world can be conceptualized as a series of metropolis satellite relationships, with surpluses being exported at each intermediate metropolis, which itself becomes a satellite of another. This relationship is central to Frank's explanation of the underdevelopment of the satellites, which do not retain economic growth, and the development of the metropolis, which benefit from the absorption of economic surplus. As a result, 4 hypotheses were formed. Hypothesis number 1. In the contrast to the development of the world metropolis, which is no one's satellite, the development of national and other subordinate metropolises is limited by their satellite status. Hypothesis number 2. Satellites experience their greatest economic development when their ties to the metropolis are weakest. Hypothesis number 3. When the metropolis recovers from its crisis and reestablishes the satellite system, then the previous industrialization of these countries is choked off. And lastly, hypothesis number 4. Regions that are most feudal and underdeveloped today are those that had closest ties to the metropolis in the past. The premises of the dependency theory are that poor nations provide natural resources, cheap labor, a destination for obsolete technology, and markets for developed nations, without which the latter could not have the standard of living they enjoy. Wealthy nations actively perpetuate a state of dependency by various means. This influence may involve economics, media control, politics, banking and finance, education, culture, and sport. Not only do dependency theories present a conceptual framework for analyzing third world politics, they also suggest several solutions for the central problem of inequality. They argue that third world countries can take steps to improve their situations. One suggestion would be the formation of common markets, trading blocs, or cartels. The idea is that third world countries share many common economic and trading problems in their relations with industrialized core. By joining together and presenting a common front to the core, they will gain leverage and be able to secure greater advantage for their interactions with world core countries. By forming groups or cartels, the periphery nations will have more power than any individual third world country has in its relations with the core. The second suggestion for improving the situation is to force third world country elites to confront their country's condition of dependency and take voluntary steps to alter it. Thus, elites in the capital might be convinced to use some of their wealth to invest in nation's construction projects or literacy programs, rather than importing luxury automobiles and taking expensive vacations abroad. The goal is for the elites to suspend their selfish habits of conspicuous consumption and to use their wealth for national development. The elites would be encouraged to invest in their home countries rather than abroad. More radical dependency theories called for revolutionary solutions. They argued that it is unrealistic to expect those currently in position of power to take voluntary actions which would personally disadvantage us. The only realistic solution is revolutionary action to rid the country of those leaders who have betrayed it and to institute sweeping revolutionary change to end inequality. It should be noted in conclusion that dependency position is fundamentally anti-status quo. They argue that the case of their unjust situation are existing national and international economic and political systems. They call for systematic change to solve the problems. Rather than endorsing and embracing stability, they call for radical change. As for them, stability is the main problem.